Welcome to Learn to Embroider. To get started, the things you will need are an embroidery or sewing needle, a pair of scissors, a piece of fabric, preferably cotton fabric, something that is pretty tightly woven together, and an embroidery hoop. This one that we're using is 6 inches, but you can use any of the varying sizes. And then we also have 6-strand embroidery floss. We're going to go through several basic embroidery stitches, starting with 4 that are ones you can use in lines, in lettering, creating stems if you're embroidering flowers, anything that is using straight lines. We will then go over some other stitches that are useful for filling in or creating different designs as you're stitching. First, we are going to need to thread our needle. So we're using embroidery floss here. This is cotton thread that has 6 strands. So when you, let me find the end of this here. When you pull your thread out and take a closer look at the end, you'll see that there are actually several different strands within this one thread. So we're actually going to separate the thread in half. So we're going to split it so that there are 3 strands that we're going to put on our needle. First, we need to cut this, so let me go ahead and do that. And then usually it's easier to work with the cut side of the thread. So let me find our 3 threads here, and they kind of go all over the place, but you're going to start by splitting them. And I like to keep hold of the 2 ends in my right hand and kind of keep them at an even tension so it's easier to pull them apart with my left thumb. Usually I have to drop them for a little bit. And they want to curl up on you. So be careful when you let go that they don't immediately try to jump back together. So I'm gonna pull this apart. Yep, see, they're trying to get stuck at the end. The other thing is that as you're going, at the end, it wants to twist up really tight. So you might have to straighten it out a little bit as you go. All right, and now we have 2 separate strands of thread, each with 3 strands each. And you can choose however many strands you want to use as you go. Sometimes if you are doing something that is really delicate, you want only a few strands. Other times if you are stitching something big and bold, you might want to use all 6 strands. But today we're going to start with 3. This also helps your thread last a little bit longer and go a little bit further when you split it up. You're going to thread the needle, getting all 3 of those strands through. Sometimes I hardly ever get it on the first try. And it does help to dampen your thread so that they all kind of stick together. So now we've got it through our needle, and we're gonna pull it through the end. So now we've got the ends of the thread here, and I'm just gonna tie a knot. Okay, there we go. Got our knot. I'm actually gonna trim this a little bit. Not super close down to the knot, but I'm going to trim it so that we don't have a lot of excess thread in the way when we are stitching. Because sometimes these loose ends will try to get caught up in your stitching. Okay. So we've got our thread here and our needle. The first stitch we are going to learn is the running stitch. And this is probably the one you are most familiar with if you're thinking about hand sewing something. It's when you're just kind of going straight through your fabric up and down. So we're gonna start here, poking our needle through from the bottom at the very beginning of the line and then pulling it through. For the running stitch, we're going to put our needle back through just a little bit ahead and then pull it. And we've got one stitch. Make sure you can see that. Okay, and then you can see this is what it looks like on the back. So we've got where we came in and then where we just put it back through. So for a running stitch, we are going to then go a little bit ahead, place our needle back in, and pull it through again. And then we just keep going through. And you can make your stitches as close together as you want them to be. So this is pulling it back through pretty much right in the same spot. So you'll see that there's just a tiny little bit of thread right there on the back side, and then pulling it through. So this doesn't look super pretty because I was skipping lengths, but this is your running stitch. Just straightforward, back and forth sewing. Okay. Be careful. We've got a good example here. Your thread wants to try to knot up on you. So when this happens, you can pull this back out and try to straighten it a little bit. It's gotten a little twisted, which is fine, but that's why it tries to turn itself into a knot. But when you pull it out, usually it's easy to straighten, and see, it wants to do that again. So ooh. I'm gonna stick my needle through here so that it doesn't get a chance to do that, and then pull. So we've got a clean stitch there and no knots. If you do have knots, it's all right. You can just kind of keep going. Speaking of knots though, when we get to the end, I'm gonna put in one more stitch here, and to tie this one off, I am going to stick my needle in the back of the previous stitch so that it goes through, and then pull my needle underneath this loop, if I can keep a hold of it, and then pull, And I keep my finger down on it so that the knot stays close to the fabric as I pull, because otherwise it'll want to jump up and tie a knot somewhere high up here. So then you can pull and you've got your thread knotted. And then we can just cut it off. Again, trying to keep this close to the knot so that it doesn't get in the way. And now with this end, I'm just going to tie it off into another knot. And we can keep going. So the next stitch we're going to do is the back stitch. So this one is very similar to the running stitch, and it starts the same way. We're going to poke our needle up from the bottom and do one running stitch to get started, going back through. Okay, and then instead of coming back up and going forward, what we're gonna do, if you can see my needle poking up, oh, I missed it. My needle poking up here. I'm gonna go a little ways out from that first stitch, poke my needle up through, and instead of going forward, I'm gonna go backwards. So I'm gonna put my needle in right next to the very first stitch and poke it through. So we're just gonna repeat that going forward. All right, pulling it through. I'm putting my needle right next to that last stitch. So going ahead, pulling my needle through, putting it in right there. Back stitch is really good for lines, especially lines of text, just because as you go back, it makes a pretty even line. All right. And you'll see the difference in the back here. Back stitch makes a solid line as you go along on the back. Running stitch has gaps where each of the stitches are because you're going back and forth. But you'll tie it off the same way. Stick your needle through that last stitch. In this case, just underneath whatever threads that you can get your needle under, just so that it has something secure to tie off to. And then tie your knot. The next stitch is called the chain stitch. And this is a pretty decorative stitch, but again, starts the same way. Pull your needle through, and then we're gonna create a little bit of a loop here in the thread, and then put our needle back right next to where it came from and pull, not all the way through, keep that little loop there. And then with your needle, you're going to come up wherever you want the end of your stitch to be, somewhere within that loop, so that when you pull up, it creates a little double link, so it kind of looks like a chain link. So to keep going, you do the same thing. So you're going to put your needle back through right next to that last stitch. I've got my thumb over some of the thread here so that it doesn't pull all the way through. And when it comes to a little bit of a loop, push your needle up from the bottom, pull through, and you've got another loop. So that is the chain stitch. And once you get to the end of this one, you want to make sure you tie off underneath your fabric every time. So to finish it, just put your needle on the outside of that loop and take it down. So that secures that final loop to the fabric. Same thing, tie it off. The next stitch we're going to do is called the stem stitch. So pull your needle through. Push it back down about a stitch length away. I'm still holding on to this bit with my thumb. And then I'm taking my needle and pulling it back through right next to that very first stitch. So we're going to keep going out and then pushing it back up through there. So it's kind of overlapping as we go along. So the next stitch we're gonna do is called the French knot. So this is used often in creating floral designs. It can also be punctuation, or it could be your whole piece if you want to do a whole bunch of little French knots to kind of fill in your design. So to do a French knot, I've pulled up from the bottom. I'm going to take my needle and thread kind of in a circle. I'm going to stick the thread or the needle under the thread, pull it around. So we've got a loop around the needle. I'm going to stick my needle right back where it came through. I'm going to keep this tight here with my thumb as I'm going so that it keeps a small knot in place there. So that is a 1 loop French knot. You can also continue to wrap your needle through the thread multiple times. So if we go 2 times and down and pull it, it's getting gradually bigger, and then do 1, 2, 3. Put it back down, pull it tight. And there is your 3-loop French knot. Not a whole lot of difference, but they do get a little bit bigger. And if you were using more strands of thread, if you were using all 6 strands, the knot would be even bigger. Okay, the next stitch we're gonna do is really similar to the chain stitch that we did before. It's called the Lazy Daisy stitch. So what we're gonna do is pull our needle through, stick it back down right where it came through, keeping my thumb over the left side of the thread until we've got our loop. And then to secure the daisy petal, we're gonna bring our needle up right at the tip of the petal on the inside, pull it through, and then put our needle down right on the outside. So there's a little stitch that secures our daisy petal right there. And then keep going. Bring it through, put it back down, right next to where we came up. Try to make sure your thread doesn't get caught. Pull it through. And you can kind of move this loop around so you get it right where you want it. Hold it down, bring the needle up on the inside, and then put it down right on the outside. And you can keep going around until you have yourself a little daisy. Tying it off on the back, same thing. Underneath the previous stitch, which in this case is pretty big. So I'm going to wrap my needle through the thread, holding it down with my pointer finger and pulling it tight. The last stitch we're going to learn is the satin stitch. And this is kind of, if you think about coloring in a shape or a design, this is doing that, but with thread. So I'm going to start on this circle here. I'm going to point my needle through right on the edge so that I can make a little stitch right along the edge. Now, instead of continuing to go around, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over so you can see it, but I'm going to put my needle back through close to where I came up. So it kind of seems like we're going to start doing a running stitch, but instead I'm going to bring it back down here a little ways further down. And then I'm going to take my needle a little bit further down and then take it up. So if you can see, we're starting to fill in the circle. you can take your thread, your needle and thread, and just like loop it as if you were doing a running stitch almost, just going back and forth and back and forth. That would end up covering completely the back of your circle as well, and using up a lot of your thread. So I like to do it this way, where you're kind of going in right next to it, doing a little running stitch, whoop, from where you started. Oh, but see, talking about it now, I just did it the opposite way. So I've got that long stitch there, which is totally fine. You can keep going and just put it back through. This time I'm gonna do it from the bottom and bringing it up. So you would continue to do that until your entire circle is covered. So I have an example here of those completed stitches. I was using some scrap fabric, so it looks like it's got a little bit of a paint splatter design on it, but that's just the fabric. So you can see with the satin stitch, it's filled out the whole circle. I ran out of thread, so I had to change color. This is our completed lazy daisy, our stem stitch, chain stitch, back stitch, and for the running stitch on this one, I was doing them pretty close together. But you can see a difference between the back stitch and the running stitch with the little spaces in between the running stitch. And these are some single loop French knots. And this is a look at the back. So you can see our circle here is pretty clean. There's no extra fabric there. So here I've got a little design of a bookshelf. In this case, I have used satin stitch on everything. Now you can choose whatever stitches you want to fill out your little bookshelf. If you wanted to do a back stitch around each of the books and leave them blank on the inside, you can. If you wanted to add some daisies in your flower pot, you can do that. Or create a succulent with some French knots, you can do that. Just experiment and see what stitches you like to use most, what you like to practice with. See if you could add some letters maybe. This is a little small to write titles on the books, but you could add a saying up at the top or down at the bottom. However you want to embellish your bookshelf, you now have the tools you need with these stitches that we've gone over to create whatever you would like. I will say, and this is not necessary, I have used pencil and pen to draw my own designs or trace designs onto fabric. In this case, I have used a water erasable pen that I just got off of Amazon. So once I've stitched all of these in, I can just put the fabric in some water and the blue marks will all go away. So you can see I've got a little extra here where I drew a little bit wide on the flower pot, but I corrected it with my stitches. Once I am finished and I put it in water, that blue mark will go away. And the same thing will happen with the kits that we have prepared. So I traced everything with these blue markers. So once you're done, you can rinse them and you will get rid of those blue marks. If you are knitting or crocheting a blanket for our Knittin' for Kittens drive, you can also use some of this fabric to create a tag to embroider and attach to your blanket. These hoops are a little bit big to be the entire tag, but you can always mark a little square or rectangle on the inside with a pen or pencil. create a little design on the inside that maybe says made with love or made by hand, or has your name or something like that on the inside. Stitch it with your new embroidery skills, and then once you take it out of the hoop, you can cut it out and stitch it using that running stitch to your blanket before you donate it. If you're interested in embroidery, we do have plenty of books at the library that you can check out that have patterns and more stitches and more tips and tricks for learning to embroider.